Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome to today's program Chris Timmer, who is Chief Commercial Officer at LeanLogistics. And today we're going to be talking about building a strong foundation in transportation management. Now, the the idea here is when you look at the supply chain strategies that companies across all industries are embarking on and trying to execute, transportation management is really at the core, at the foundation of a lot of those strategies. And it follows then that in order to successfully execute those strategies, you really need to have a strong transportation management foundation. But what does that mean exactly, right? And so that's a question that we're going to explore today with Chris, and I'm very happy to have him on the program. Just a reminder that part of our goal here at Talking Logistics is to make this conversational. So as Chris and I are kind of talking through some of these points, if you've got a question for Chris, you can do so via the submit a question button or via the chat feature. And I'll keep an eye on it. And certainly if we've got time and it's a good and appropriate question, I'll weave it into the conversation. Just a reminder that if you are joining us as a visitor, you do have to sign in first in order to be able to ask a question. So with that, Chris, welcome to the program.
Adrian, thank you. I appreciate you having me on, and as a transportation geek by nature, it's fun to talk about these things.
Excellent. So, before we dive into the topic, I always like to ask my guests the first time they're in the program, just to provide some context, some perspective in terms of where they're coming from, right? So, why don't you tell us a little bit about your career path, how and why you got involved with supply chain logistics, and what your current role and responsibilities are there at LeanLogistics.
Well, I am the Chief Commercial Officer at LeanLogistics, and was one of the group that started the company back in late 1999, early 2000s. I've spent really the last 24 years in the transportation industry, from early 3PL work that I did and working with doing some supply chain management from an operating perspective, transportation management, warehousing management, helped build a 4PL arm of a 3PL business. Spent a lot of time in the food and CPG industry, a little bit with a retail group. Basically, have been in the supply chain, managing and creating solutions for the supply chain for the last 24 years. Some as an operator, some on the commercial side of the business, but was really instrumental in bringing Lean to the market back in the early 2000s, and then building this company to where it's at right now.
Great. So it sounds, experience on the 3PL front, on the industry front, on the technology front. So which is what I see a lot these days from a lot of folks in the industry. Really, because all those things are important, right? Having the services side, the technology side, and the industry knowledge is so important these days in really kind of moving forward in the supply chain logistics industry. So let's talk about the topic now in terms of building a solid transportation management foundation. There's a lot of discussion these days about supply chain innovation, right? But my perspective that is that in order to succeed at innovation, you really need a solid foundation. That is, you need the right people, the right processes, the right technology to get the quote unquote the little things or the fundamentals right. So when it comes to transportation management, what are the attributes or components of a solid foundation?
Well, I think, when you first took a look at transportation, because it is such an integrated part of an overall supply chain, you need to look at it in the context of the supply chain. So what are the goals and objectives of transportation related to the things that are necessary for us to execute our business in managing kind of that lifeline through getting products, getting raw materials to manufacturing location, finished goods to customers. Transportation feeds all of that. So what is it what are the goals and objectives of transportation as an organization? And then you need to take a look at your strategy and how you're going to deploy that. How are we going to manage it? How are we going to work with carriers and our suppliers and set up ourselves for success? And then based on that, create a multifaceted foundational standard operating procedure to some extent, a foundation of how to work transportation within the environment, and then ultimately have the right people to be able to execute against that. So, with the advances in technology, the advances in strategy, the advances in really curriculum throughout, the universities that are deploying supply chain management as a curriculum for them. The skill set associated with managing transportation and managing the supply chain in today's environment is much, much different than it was, say, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So you have to have the right people with the right skill set, with the right mentality, as well as the acumen to be able to effectively manage.
Well, that's a great point about the people side. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion these days around the role of talent, right, and the shortage of talent out there, and I'm seeing a lot of activity, with companies and universities, working closely with at the education side of the industry in terms of trying to align the needs of employers with the skills and capabilities that universities and other programs are putting together in place. So you brought up, you talked about strategy, you talked about people, you talked about processes, right? Those key components in building a foundation. So let's dive into some of those components, further. Starting at the high level. I mean, I guess it all begins with developing an effective transportation strategy. What factors should companies take into account when creating their transportation strategy, and who should be involved?
Well, that's a great question, and I think that and this has evolved over time as well. If you look at transportation strategies in the past, it's who's the carriers that we're using, how do we get the best rate, do we have enough capacity, and really those are questions that will always remain. However, in looking at your business, it's become far more sophisticated in how you really develop out the overall strategy. And it kind of starts with taking a look at your customer base. And the customer base is both internal and external. So what's the segmentation of your transportation network? What is it trying to serve? How is it trying to serve it? And what are the components that drive success for that? So, what modes should we be using? What modes should we direct our business to? How do we think we need to service both internally and externally? Those are the questions that you have to ask yourself. And then once you establish what you think that's going to be, the next phase is to take a look at, okay, what do we think performance should be? We have historical performance that we've done in the past, but really to truly understand performance, you need to benchmark what's in the industry as well. So look outside the four walls of your organization and build mechanisms to benchmark yourself against peers, benchmark yourself against other organizations that might look like you. Some people look at it from the perspective of, hey, I'm a CPG company. What do other CPG companies that look like me do? When the reality is the characteristics of that supply chain or that transportation might transcend multiple different industries. So it is key to take a look at different industries and what are the characteristics, and then benchmark as well. Then take a look at kind of your carrier partners. The year over year, it depends on who's got kind of the position in the marketplace from a carrier's perspective, whether it's the shipper, whether it's the carrier. Truly, though, if you want to build a best-in-class process for developing out your strategy, you really need to take a look at how you're going to approach those carriers and what is the strategy behind that. How do you want to build the relationship and how you want to manage that? Price is always a factor, right? Everybody wants to reduce cost and improve service. That's been when I came into the industry in 1990, somebody told me right away, from a customer's perspective, I have two things I need to accomplish. I need to reduce my price, I need to improve my service, period. And 24 years later, I'm still hearing the same thing, right? So those don't necessarily change, but it's the blend of the two that makes you have to really look at it. And then finally, and I think you'll hear this from us quite a bit as an organization, is what are the continuous improvement strategies that you want to deploy in executing against your business based on how you create more sophistication and get greater intelligence into your business. So those are the types of things that I think are really critical in developing out that strategy.
You talked about cost and service, and certainly those are the two metrics, the two factors that kind of dominate the conversation usually around supply chain in general, but very specifically around transportation management. One of the things that I've been telling companies over the past few years is that we also need to get to the point where, in addition to cost and service, we're also talking about risk and thinking about risk, as we're developing our strategies, as we're thinking about the initiatives and so on and so forth. What's your thought on that? I mean, do you see risk becoming a more critical part of the conversation that companies need to take into consideration as they're developing their transportation strategies?
I do, because if you look at the competitive nature of the marketplace today and how shippers are going to market to manage their transportation, there's risk associated with the requirements of the carriers, of regulations that are in the industry, risk of the business and access to capacity, risk of service levels and competition. I think as you delve into that component of the scenario, risk management has become a significant part of how you're dealing with carriers, especially with the fragmentation of the carrier environment. Not one carrier has more than a percent or so market share. So in that, viability of carriers, long-term longevity of carriers, and the risk associated with them being a provider long-term and having access to your goods is very critical.
Now, just in terms of just to wrap up the point here on strategy, who should be involved in the conversation developing that strategy, right? Because as I mentioned in my opening remark, transportation really enables, and it's such a critical piece of so many supply chain strategies, right? That you would think that having some kind of a cross-functional team that involves other stakeholders, both internally and externally, should be part of that. Do you agree? And what do you see as kind of common out there?
Absolutely. And I think, as you know, our model here is that we manage about $1.5 billion in transportation spend for our customers. So we have technology as well as managing freight. And as we work with our clients to develop out their strategy, it's really critical that we're taking into consideration everything associated with the supply chain. So that means we have to have input, right? So we have to have an understanding, and we have to have the factors associated with the different components, whether it's finance, whether it's planning, whether it's the warehouse, the customer service. All of these individuals need to be involved in this transportation strategy so that we're effectively developing out the processes, objectives, and the business case to actually manage effectively that's supporting the overall strategy of the business. Years gone by, it was largely, hey, what's my cost, and who are my carriers, and those factors have gone. It's far more sophisticated than that today.
Great to hear. So now you kind of put the strategy in place. It seems like an easy question, right? But I'm sure it's not that trivial. How do you go about then putting it into practice?
Well, the thing is what's the mechanism that gets you there, right? How is it that you get it into practice? And really what we find is that what's critical is the development of standard, common business practice. So the standard operating procedures that allow the supply chain participants to understand what is happening in transportation. So fundamentally, it's developing out the process and the procedure, and then the challenges associated with that in many cases are things like getting adoption. How do I adopt these standard operating procedures? Once they're developed, how do I make sure that I'm complying with those standard operating procedures, and then measuring against what the expectation was? So as you look at the challenges associated with deploying a strategy comprehensively, it's got to go across multiple facets. You have to have cross-functional buy-in to the strategy, and then a broad-based understanding of what those standard operating procedures are, and then a mechanism to allow that compliance and the measurement to occur.
Now, when you talk about standard operating procedures, I mean, some companies have very decentralized transportation operations. Other companies tend to take a more centralized, approach. Any, differences or different challenges in terms of developing those SOPs, whether you're centralized or decentralized, or any thoughts just on what's the right approach, whether to take a centralized or decentralized approach?
Well, I think it all depends on the supply chain, honestly. What we are finding, and then what we take from an organizational perspective, is we take a look at from the lens of the customer. Where is the customer trying to understand how they're going to get their products or get their services or get their demand? And as you look at how that occurs, that dictates to some extent how well you execute from either a centralization standpoint or a decentralization standpoint. Some of the organizations we work with today are decentralized. Not many. I'll be honest with you, not many. Most have looked at it from a central command center capability and actually managing cross-functionally within transportation. A centralized location seems to be the best practice. Now, what we have seen, though, we have seen effective use of a platform scenario where decentralization can be enabled. So without technology or without a platform to actually manage functions effectively, a centralized command center is typically the best practice. However, with organizations that believe that they have to have a decentralized process for themselves, a common platform that allows the management to happen and effectively allows that to occur.
Yeah, I see that as well. I mean, and certainly there's a lot of buzz and discussion these days with, the whole concept of control towers. And I think those control towers can be, physical in nature in the sense of having physically, a centralized office, but also virtually in nature in terms of, like you just talked about, having a common platform that enables that, centralized view and visibility in terms of what's happening from a transportation and supply chain standpoint. So as you look across kind of examples of companies that have put their strategies or have, as they make that migration from strategy to putting it into practice, any pitfalls or mistakes that you've seen companies make?
Well, I think that if you look at the challenges, it's getting. I really see it in those three areas that I talked about before. It's the adoption. How are we adopting the components of what we need to do? The compliance. Once you do adopt them, are you adhering to the standard operating procedures? How are we working within the construct of what was designed and doing that effectively? And then the case is, how do you measure against that? So how do I measure the success factors that I have with the compliance, with the adoption, and are we generating the result that we believe that was designed on the front end of this? So when that doesn't occur, when we deal with situations and that doesn't occur, we do have issues related to how successful an organization can be.
Yeah, I'm gonna follow up on that measurement piece in just a second here. But before we go there, I want to talk about something else that you kind of mentioned, and that's the role of carriers, right? So obviously, establishing productive carrier relationships is part of building a strong transportation management foundation. What are some best practices when it comes to finding the right carrier partners and managing those relationships?
Right, and this is another area of the industry that has changed over time. When I first got into the business, it was how good can you negotiate rates, and that is an element always because you want to reduce your costs. But really, the best practice that we see within our client base, which is well over 100 customers, as well as where we help deploy the transportation model, it starts with an understanding of what that carrier is all about. So instead of looking at it from the lens of me, the shipper, I want to look at it from the lens of them, the carrier. What are the carriers doing? What are their strategies? What's their inherent network? Where are they flowing their freight as they're supporting their customer base? Because basically, what transportation is it's a myriad of networks that change on a regular basis, based on the customers that a carrier has, based on the assets that the carrier has. So really understanding that carrier and how they manage their business and what they're trying to accomplish is very, very critical. Most shippers don't necessarily take that mentality. The other component is to create a consistent communication channel for both both tactically and strategically. I like to look at the way we work with carriers as a strategically tactical relationship. We're looking at this long term. We're looking at this how you want to deploy, how you want to serve them, but how they can serve you, and then enable your supply chain to be able to work with them and how you can mutually achieve those goals. Now that comes to clear communication, consistent communication, and then defining metrics effectively which is really kind of the next one, is the mutually agreed upon metrics. How am I measuring on-time performance? What do I say my on-time performance is? My compliance with routing guides, my capabilities of actually deploying the service levels and deploying my assets and my services to support your business. And how do we commonly look at that and agree upon what the performance has been? And then, it's clear and critical for you to continue to provide an understanding of your business objectives as an organization. So, especially in some verticals today, there is a enormous amount of mergers and acquisitions and supply chain change, supply chain design occurring. Every time your supply chain changes, it dramatically affects your carrier network because their requirements change, and so that means their blend of business changes, so that their cost structures change, their capabilities to serve you changes. So having clear communication and consistent communication all feeds into that kind of business strategy. And then I think what we also see is the engagement both at a tactical level with managerial and tactical support of the business, but also at a strategic level. So throughout the organization, getting relationships and building those relationships at multiple levels within an organization is vital for that good partnership that you look for. And then, again, the final thing is how do we continue to improve our processes, to improve our business, and work within a continuous improvement scenario with the carriers to effectively get better as a shipper, but also allow them to get better as a carrier. Again, it comes back down to that kind of mutually beneficial relationship that you become what a lot of people are using as shipper of choice. What it really is just a good common business practices that allows my partner, my vendor, my supplier to effectively manage their business as I'm managing mine.
No, I mean, I love the what you start out with in terms of looking at the relationship from the carrier's lens, right? To understand what their strategies are, what their current networks look like, where they want to head to, what's important to them, in terms of then aligning that with kind of your own strategy. I think that's critically important. And you said communication. I think you said that word, I think, at least 10 times in your comments there. And I think that's what I hear across the industry, right? I mean, it sounds very basic and simple, but having clear, concise, continuous communication, back and forth is, not only important with, carriers, but any business partner, right? That is an integral part of your executing your strategy, because we all know that nothing ever goes according to plan, and things are going to be changing continuously, and kind of providing that forward visibility, having those conversations on an ongoing basis is important. So let's talk about the measurement side now. Everyone knows the saying, you can't manage what you don't measure. Right. So which metrics matter the most, and what are some best practices in how companies define and use metrics?
Again, you look at the evolution of metrics, and it used to be, what am I paying? What's my cost per pound? What's my rate on this lane? And the reality is that's kind of the base level of what people will look at. What's my fundamental cost year over year? Okay, that's great. We're measuring that, but it's the back end of that and the deeper dive into the metrics that really become a best practice in looking at the business. So there's always cost metrics and there's always service metrics. But in the context of that, really the best practices that we see. So you've got your generic on-time performance, you've got your on-time pickup, on-time delivery from a service perspective, you got your cost per pound, cost per load, cost per unit type of metrics that you'd look at from a cost perspective. But really, where we see clients getting to from a perspective of best practices is driving that into total cost to serve. So from a transportation perspective, what does it cost to service customer X? What does it cost to service customer Y? What is our total cost to serve a business unit? Whether I've got this product line or that product line, or this business unit or that business unit, or this region or that region. This is where we start to see the blend of the cost and service come together, which really then kind of takes you to the next level from a metrics perspective. And then the underlying layer of that is what ultimately can you utilize for predictive analytics. So taking a look at, here's my measurements that I look at today, and then how do I take the output of that, the data of that, and then create a predictive capability to see what I'm going to be doing. Ultimately, though, you have to wrap this in benchmarks and continuing to benchmark. Anytime we implement a technology customer or a managed transportation services customer, what we like to do is we like to do a benchmark. Lean provides a Leandex from a perspective of cost to certain lanes. And as you look at the business as a whole, establishing what a benchmark is, that baseline, and then creating the metric to say, how do I believe this is success at a more granular level than kind of the generics that have been in the industry for a long time, are very, very critical. Obviously, technology helps in doing that, obviously data, but it's also the intelligence that goes behind what are we trying to accomplish with these metrics. So, some of the best practices really around the total cost to serve, where we're blending both service and cost, and that's where you kind of bring your evaluation to the next level as it relates to how successful you are as a transportation organization.
I think going back as well to your comment about having standard operating procedures, I think, and what I see as another best practice is really not treating metrics as a standalone kind of report, disconnected from the day-to-day business process, where you really want to have the metrics drive continuous improvement processes and really answer the question, well, what are we going to do with this data, right? I mean, are we just collecting it for the sake of collecting it and looking at it and discussing it, or is this data, these metrics, tied into business processes that are going to react and get kicked off as a result of what we're seeing and the trends that we're seeing in the data? Is that what you're seeing as well?
Absolutely. It's interesting. One of our clients that we work with, we have a whole process where we're redefining the metric of the business. So as you look at, there's these objectives that it's basically this mentality. They have a process called reinventing our cost structure. So there's a whole metric around reinventing our cost structure and developing new metrics based on the evolutions of metrics that we've had in the past where we've changed business process. So now that we have that, how do we reinvent how we're evaluating our success and then measuring against and then challenging that with, okay, continuous improvement, what's our next advancement as we get this intelligence? From our perspective, transportation is the data associated with transportation, the capability of getting visibility in transportation, and then building that into the proper strategy, it's become an exercise in intelligence. And as we get greater intelligence, we can then build better processes around the greater intelligence that we obtain. You can only get that through getting good data, measuring yourself effectively, and having good standard operating procedures in place.
Great points. We're coming up short on time here. I've got a couple of more questions, but I just want to remind those of you in the audience attending live today that if you do have a question for Chris, now would be the time to ask it either via the chat feature or the submit a question button. So Chris, now obviously we talked about processes and standard operating procedures. We talked about the strategy piece. The other leg of that stool is technology, right? And obviously technology plays a critical role in not only transportation but in a lot of supply chain management. It's kind of the key enabler. And obviously when it comes to building a foundation, it's going to play a role. So what are some of the important solutions and capabilities that companies should have in place as they're building and trying to create a solid transportation management foundation?
Yeah, if you look at technology, and we've now gotten to an area where is, the sexy part of it, right? The technology. How does technology enable all these processes to occur? What we've been talking about is building foundational standard operating procedures, building continuous improvement processes, communicating effectively, managing the processes effectively. All of that can be enabled by the proper technology. If you look at from a planning, execution, settlement capability, visibility, business intelligence, it all is driven by technology that can be enabled to reduce cost, reduce inefficient processes, to gain visibility, and really visibility is probably the key. Now that we have the capabilities to actually touch components, and again, we go back to our statement about transportation being kind of the lifeline for the supply chain, having that visibility through the activities is very, very critical, not only from a perspective of being able to manage the relationships and manage the processes, but also understanding what's happening at a real-time standpoint. So you look at that, you look at the foundational component of managing standard processes. TMS applications or technology allows you to do that effectively. In some cases, it also allows you to get access to capacity. In the instance of the Lean network, you have a single instance multi-tenant environment where you already have carriers connected into the relationship. So as you build strategy, you can build those processes into understanding the technology can enable all of that to occur. It can also enable inefficient and ineffective processes like web settle or like settlement capabilities, the freight payment, freight management, payment processes that can be eliminated based on the fact that you've got a technology in place to be able to execute that. So from the perspective of how does technology drive all of this, it allows you to drive the compliance, it allows you to assure the adoption, and it also allows you to measure the entire process, the entire component of transportation extremely effectively. It allows you options and capabilities in managing through optimization, through tendering, through spot market capabilities, through the elimination of settlement capabilities, an efficient and effective best practice in how you manage transportation. Now, if you don't have technology, really that's not going to be, it's going to be very, very difficult. And that's where we see the adoption of TMS has been so prevalent over the last 10 years, and it's been commonplace in best practice relationships. I think the last key in there in the technology is then the acquisition of the data, the leverage of data, the capabilities of doing something with data to then build a best practice moving forward or build a continuous improvement process and also benchmark. So I referenced LeanDex and some of the things that Lean does from the perspective of benchmarking. That data, if that resides in your platform, allows you to effectively be more sophisticated in how you manage it, but also streamline and make it more simplistic related to how your team and your people actually manage the transportation processes.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things about the technology piece and specifically a TMS is really the link that it has with the people side. And what I mean by that is that a TMS is really a living, breathing implementation technology solution, because the reality is that you deploy a TMS today and it's reflective of your transportation network and your transportation strategy and your carrier base today. But we all know that if you make an acquisition, as you talked about earlier, or you implement a new lane, or you pick up a new customer, 6 months from now, 9 months from now, your network might look different, your constraints might look different, and unless you are able to tune the TMS, if you will, to reflect on an ongoing basis the current realities, you can get the garbage in, garbage out type of scenario. So really having what I would call a power user, someone that really understands what's happening on the business side and the network side, and can then effectively translate that on the technology side, and so that the technology is aligned with what's happening in reality, I think is critically important. Do you see that as well?
Oh, absolutely. And again, what we've been talking about is tying it into the entire supply chain. But it's the blend of what technology can provide versus what is the business process owner, and that expertise that then can allow the functional processes to work. So I think that yes, absolutely right. Our client base, the way we deploy the technology, it's very critical that you have business users that are capable of actually leveraging a technology to do the things that are necessary to be successful. And then build on that. And I think that's the other thing that's been exciting about being in the technology environment over the last 14 years, is that what we have seen is the evolution and the escalation of sophistication of business processes, Technology can be delivered or can be developed to address the business processes, but it's the level of thinking and the depth of thought associated with how we advance this that makes it so critical in continuing to build best practices and continuously improve our supply chains as a whole. It's really exciting. Transportation, when we first started this years and years and years ago, was about tendering loads more effectively and building loads. And now it's about creating visibility across the entire supply chain, connecting everybody associated with it, and then continuing to build to what you were talking about earlier, the flexibility within your network to adjust and move and tact as we have to change our environment on a regular basis.
Great points. We've got a question here from Tad Kelly. I'm going to go ahead and put it on the air. It's kind of related to metrics. So let me go ahead and read it. So he asks, what are some effective ways of developing good benchmarks for your metrics, particularly when you have little experience or history, lack of historical data, managing transportation?
Well, I think going to outside resources and gathering data associated with businesses that may look like you is really critical. How do I know that I'm doing well when I don't know that I'm doing well, right? That's the question. And the reality is that I need to look at supply chains that look like me, product lines or businesses that look like me, size, scope, what have you, to identify whether or not, a benchmark data is applicable or not. I may be a smaller shipper and I don't have really good data, but as I go to market, should I have the same type of cost structure or service environment that a larger shipper might have? What do companies like I do in the marketplace, and what should be my expectations? Developing out that, getting source data that is in the context of your business. And the other is potentially partnering with somebody that can provide you the expertise and some of that source data to help you build out those metrics.
Great. Thank you, Chad. Appreciate the question. I guess as a kind of a way to wrap up here, Chris, what questions should companies ask themselves to determine if they've got a solid transportation management foundation, and what actions can they take to close whatever gaps they see?
Sure. I go back to some fundamental questions. Does my transportation network either hinder or harm my supply chain? Is it an impediment for efficiency? Is it cost prohibitive? Is it a driver that is enabling what I want to do from a supply chain perspective, or is it something that is causing me issues? Do I know my true cost of transportation? Do I know what the underlying costs of transportation are for me, both from a direct cost to carriers, but also a total cost of service to my customers, both externally and internally from that standpoint? Does everyone that's involved in the process that touches transportation, are they engaged, and do they understand the objectives? Do I have objectives that are mapped out for us? What are we expecting out of transportation, or is just transportation the tail of the dog? And in many organizations, the transportation is the tail of the dog. How am I managing and measuring myself as an organization? How do I define success? And then how do I think I'm performing against that? There's a myriad of questions that we could continue to ask, but these are kind of the strategic questions. What am I really expecting out of transportation? So how do you close the gap, so to speak? How do you become more effective, and what are some action steps you can do? Well, one is to define the needs of the business that need to be addressed by transportation. Developing out that proper strategy, blending in, looking at carriers. What do I want to do from a service perspective? How do I get the objectives of other components within the supply chain that I'm effectively managing this? One of the biggest challenges we've had in the past is, well, my warehousing costs go down, my transportation costs go up. My transportation costs go down, but my warehousing costs go up. There needs to be a blend there, and that's where the entire process needs to be holistically looked at. Build a foundation through standard operating procedures, but then deploying that, looking at it from a perspective of how can I leverage technologies, and how can I leverage advanced technologies that are doing more than just actually providing me feature functionality, but providing me data, providing me expertise, providing me the capabilities that I can take my transportation to the next level. and then ultimately, develop out a baseline of metrics. I think what happens is most organizations don't have a good set of metrics that they start with. So my recommendation is establish a baseline of metrics, and then as you get more data and as you get more results, then start questioning those and evolve those metrics to get more and more sophisticated, and then be able to deliver that back to the business. I think those are some key kind of here's what to do next related to this. I couldn't leave this conversation without saying that technology is really a driver in all of this. If you don't have a technology platform in place that's actually enabling all of these things to occur, you can have the best strategy and you can have the best people, but if they're doing things manually or they're doing things in an environment that doesn't allow them to be efficient, then it really makes it difficult. So it's really, as you were talking about the legs of the stool, you got to have the people, you got to have the processes, you got to have the strategy, and then underlying all of it, you have to have the technology and a technology partner that helps you continue to advance your capabilities as you move forward.
Excellent advice and questions. And with that, unfortunately, we're out of time for today. But I know we're going to continue to build on this conversation in future episodes as we continue to kind of explore this topic in terms of building a solid foundation and kind of what the next steps are to continue to drive, ultimately get to that point where we can drive innovation and continuous improvement in not only from a transportation perspective but from a supply chain a strategy execution perspective as well. I want to thank you all who joined us today and for your questions. If you are watching this episode on demand and you do have a question or a comment for Chris, you can find this episode on talkinglogistics.com, and you can post a comment or a question there, and I'm sure Chris will be more than happy to follow up via that platform Absolutely. As well. So Chris, thank you very much again for making the time to be with us today.
Adrian, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss topics like this. It's exciting for us and enjoyed it.
Great. Again, thank you, everyone, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.